So let's dive right in. Our objective with being the DevOps for like the Lumen starter repo is we want to do as much as we can to empower teams to build quality software. And so we very much don't want this to feel um, like a very top-down approach. Definitely, if there's something in the starter that you look at it and you see, actually, if we tweak this thing a little bit, it could be a lot easier to use. Or if we tweak the documentation a little bit, it could be easier to read and easier to understand. So please give us feedback on that, as well as what testing tools are available. If you think there's a better tool we should use, absolutely hit us up on that. So let's start by talking about what is in the Lumen starter testing, what is in the Lumen starter repo from a testing perspective. So PHP unit comes out of the box with Lumen, and we kind of see that as a really good tool for unit functional, and from an API perspective, it can also be really good for acceptance testing as well. We've also included Dread, and Dread serves, it can serve as an acceptance testing tooling as well. Dread is, the reason we included it in the Lumen starter was more to test the API documentation. The objective being when your Dread tests pass, you know that when your API documentation says a certain request hits the API, returns a certain response, that's what Dread is testing. If that response changes and the documentation is out of date, Dread will fail. So let's dig into PHP unit a little bit. So PHP unit, you hear it and you think this is just a unit testing framework, which it is. There's an example of that here. This is it's standard input-output testing. In the sample test I've included here, there's no mocks and everything. It's just a very, very straightforward unit test. Mockery is our recommended solution for mocking objects. So that allows you to say things like, the dependency of the class I'm testing should return this, and simulate its responses. So if you're not familiar with testing, mockery is how you selectively choose what you're testing and kind of stage a certain response or a certain output from a class. Ideally, we want to mock as little as possible, but we also want to maintain input-output testing as much as possible as well. So that's this is kind of an opinionated space, and I would say, I know I for one am definitely still a student, and I'm learning constantly from other developers. So there's a good balance between focusing on input-output and when to mock. So in this test case, there's the actual assertion is performed by this assert equals, and PHP unit has probably about 50 different types of assertion methods that do different things. Everything from checking that a key is in an array, checking that an XML value value's attribute is set to a certain thing. There's all kinds of helper methods there. So I highly suggest going through the PHP unit documentation, looking at all the different ways it can help you run assertions, because there's a lot of good stuff there, and it keeps your code a lot cleaner. Does anybody have any questions about PHP unit and the way it's used as a unit testing framework? Okay. So acceptance testing, Lumen comes out of the box with a series of methods, series of helper methods that will do things under the covers to allow you to use PHP unit kind of more of a acceptance testing framework. Now what I mean by that is, so I have an example test over here on the right side, and if you look at this test, it's simulating a request as a given user. There's assertion methods based on the response, And there's also a URL endpoint defined, as well as data that's being posted. Now, this does not actually make the request. I want to be sure, make sure everybody understands that. This is not making a request in the same sense that you would make a curl request to an API endpoint. What this is doing is this is setting session information internally, and it's kind of mocking the concept of a request. And then it's sending that through the Laravel internals. So when this test passes, it doesn't necessarily mean that your Nginx is configured correctly. You could have an error in your Nginx config that is not highlighted and not discovered by this kind of acceptance test. Does that make sense to everybody? Are there any questions about what that's doing under the covers when you would do something like this? Okay. So functional tests, I pulled this from another application that we have in-house here. This is actually a PHP unit test. And so to kind of set the stage a little bit for what you're looking at, this product that this test exists on, it has a CSV importing functionality. And there are a variety of, so we have one acceptance test that simulates what the user does. So it actually goes through, opens a browser, visits a page, uploads a CSV, asserts that data was inserted correctly based on that CSV that was provided. And then we have a series of functional tests that do not interact with the user interface. And this is one of those. Our objective is interacting with the user interface is slow in the same way curl requests can be slow if you have to rely on Docker to be running, your Docker containers to be configured. There can be quicker ways to determine failure there within your domain logic than waiting on all of that to spin up. So in this case, this test verifies that two contacts were merged on the CSV that were uploaded. Again, it's not testing any CSV uploading functionality. This is a test that is making sure a certain thing happens when a CSV is uploaded. And essentially, it's kind of hard to tell by looking at it, but this test sets the stage. So it creates two different lists of contacts, performs two different imports, and then runs assertions that those two contacts were merged, so that basically the system was intelligent enough to pick up that they're actually the same person. So rather than duplicating that contact, we're going to merge them together. And there's all kinds of criteria for how to handle details about the merge, but that's not the point of this test. So this test doesn't actually it doesn't actually process the request lifecycle. It just seeds data in the database, runs the necessary classes to simulate an import, and then runs assertions on the database. And so this is one way you could do something like a functional test within Lumen that focuses on the domain of the application. Again, this will not test any Nginx endpoints, anything like that. I wanted to show this because when we started thinking of functional tests within our application, as we went through the process of getting further and further testing focused here, we thought of everything through an acceptance testing perspective of kind of, I guess, a little bit maybe more of a QA approach of with every test, we're going to log in as a user. We're going to click through the interface to get to the page we need, and then we're going to test to make sure that functionality works. But as we built out our test suite, things were running very, very slow, and it was taking a long time. And so testing the user interface once or twice or minimally and building more functional tests to focus on the domain was one approach to really speed up our test suite. Are there any questions, feedback, anything about writing tests like this in PHP unit that anybody has?
Hey
Okay.
Ben,
Yes.
um, question on the functional test. So I've always had a habit of not just writing to make sure my assertions work, but making sure that the code can handle gracefully, crazy or malformed data or anything like that as well. I mean, is that something you guys suggest as well with this moving forward? Is not just count equals one, but what happens if the data is bad? What happens if other input is entered that's not right, et cetera? Like physically trying to break it to see through the whole life cycle that it handles it gracefully.
Sure. So in this case, on this slide, I've included one test. To your point, Jason, there's probably 2 dozen other tests maybe about this functionality that handle scenarios like if there's a problem with a contact, how is that handled? Is that being recorded correctly? Um, Specific things like invalid data, things, attempts at inputting malicious data. We have solved that in the past at the unit testing level on validating classes and wherever the step in the application is for the validation happens. Um, but yes, absolutely. In the same ways, we need to know that our applications are performing up to par and are doing what we expect them to do. Part of that is are we handling errors correctly? Are developers notified in the ways they expect to be notified if there's failures? Are users notified in those same ways? These are all of the things that we need to think about from a testing perspective. Our end objective with the testing we're trying to get to with Lumen starters to empower teams to ship it and go to launch. And what we mean by that is we would love for everybody, and we have some apps here that we can pretty much do this with, where you just merge to master and then go to launch because everything else is automated, everything else is fail safe, your tests pass, so you don't need to deploy and then sit there and babysit it to make sure everything goes through okay. Um, so that's our end game, and a big portion of that is testing, testing both failure scenarios and passing scenarios. Um, it is kind of a slippery slope because you don't want to be caught over testing. You can definitely do that. For every passing scenario, there's usually like 5 or 6 failing scenarios. So you don't want to overdo it. Maybe just start with the most likely scenarios. Or in some cases with validation, we've on a functional level taken the approach of we're going to test and make sure that error messages are present in the UI or are being recorded. But as far as like what specific forms of validation are being tested, what specific error messages are, things like that, we may leave to a unit level. So yeah, Jason, thanks for chiming in on that. Does anybody else have any questions or input? Anything they want to add? Okay, we'll move on. Whoops. Okay, so here's actually a little bit more of a picture of some other tests that accompanied that previous test. So again, we don't want to retest what's already being tested. These are functional tests. I'm not testing the user interface over and over. And in this case, we've chosen to name tests to describe behavior. One of the perspectives we had when we built out a full application and we had a very large test suite that I think exceeded like 300 and something tests by the time you factored in unit, functional, and acceptance. It may have been more than that. It's been a few months now since I've looked at it. But at one point, we went back and refactored all of our method names to describe what the application does. Our objective was if I'm a developer and I want to know what the application does, I should be able to run the tests in verbose mode to see the names of the tests, and that output would describe what the application does. And also from a maintainability perspective, this is a fantastic form of self documentation. Public function can import the same contact to multiple lists. So what do you guys think that functional test is testing? To make sure you can import the same contact to multiple lists. Um, And so I would highly encourage you to think about the behavior and name functional tests based on the behavior. We found it to be very, very beneficial. Are there any input on that? Okay. So as we shift focus and talk about API documentation, so Dread is a tool we've already mentioned. Dread is, in order to do any form of automation, you've got to have some level of standardization. Most of you guys have heard about this so far. So we've looked at Swagger and Blueprint, API Blueprint, and some other tooling, and decided that API Blueprint is right now the most appealing thing because it offers more automation than some of the other tooling available. An API Blueprint is a markdown-driven API documentation standard. And some of the things we thought about when we were making this decision was, okay, so do we really want like pages and pages of annotations in the code? What about when you put an example request, example response? That can get, your code can become very married to the documentation. It can even be hard to sift through the code due to a large number of annotations. And we also kind of took a step back and we were like, if you're documenting an API and you have an example request, example response, we didn't want to find ourselves in a scenario down the road where we have our set of controllers, our set of functionality, this is version 1, and all of our annotations are there. Well, now we're doing version 2 of the API. So what happens to all that? Are we duplicating the annotations between the two controllers where maybe just some underlying code structure has changed? So we favored API Blueprint partially because the level of automation and tooling around it, but also because it allows us to organize our code without having to think about is the documentation still going to make sense after I move this class or rename this thing or change this value. And so we felt like the separation there was valuable. So to give you a picture of what that looks like, in API Blueprint, you can define data structures. So here's a good example. You can define the properties, potential values, define some limitations, whether it's required, what kind of format, what kind of data type a given value is. And then you can use that within the documentation of requests. So in this example, the data structure defines a blog post and an author, and the request response documentation defines you can hit posts, it'll retrieve all posts, that's a GET request, expect a 200 response in JSON format, and it will be the attributes, the attributes will be an array of blog posts. And so this also gives you an idea of how you can do like object nesting within the API documentation. And there's lots of flexibility with how to organize this kind of documentation. Markdown files can be included in other Markdown files, and there's a lot of control over the organization. Are there any questions about this so far? Okay. So, whoops. There we go. So as we talk more about Dread specifically, Dread's purpose is it parses API Blueprint documentation. It submits curl requests based on that documentation and performs assertions on the responses from the API based on the documentation. So this is actually an example that this is the command line output from the master branch of the Lumen starter repo currently. In that repo, we have examples of how to do API Blueprint, examples of, we already have Dread running in CI. And so in this case, it's parsing that markdown files, making the actual request, asserting the response, and in this case, it passed. Failures could happen for a lot of reasons. Could be the API documentation is out of date. It could be that the API documentation says that the blog post title says that the blog post title should be Mother's Day, but somebody actually changed the seeder and it says Father's Day now. So it does, I do want to highlight that it relies on seeded data. That's a pretty important component because it needs to be consistent. So keep that in mind as you start to use Dread and write your API documentation that seeders could be a potential cause of failure there. Are there any questions about Dread, how it runs tests, anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. It means in that case, is a seeder involved in performing any kind of tests through Dread? Sorry.
Yeah, so Himanshu, that's a really good question. And if I understood you right, you're saying like essentially what roles do seeders play in tests? So seeding is vital for running tests because we need to be able to reliably determine if something failed, like if the application broke, um, or if something else went wrong. And if we don't know what the response is going to be of a given request, or we don't know exactly what data we need to send um, to a given request or whatever it is you're testing, it's going to be difficult to run assertions to assert that yes, this should be true. This should be the first name should be Mary. And so migrations, the whole testing process relies around migrations and seeders. And so if we don't have migrations to define the data structure in the repo, and we don't have seeders, we can't run tests very quickly. Now, yes, it would be possible to spin up, import an SQL file, and populate your database otherwise. But that's going to be slow and it's going to be difficult to maintain. The migrations and seeders do a really good job of making sure everybody's on the same page, handling changes to the database state. So if, as you guys proceed, start from the beginning with migrations and seeders. And there's some really good layer casts on how to use that stuff. Um, you know, I personally haven't used migrations and seeders alongside a DBA and kind of had the back and forth of well, in our database we have all these views and some of these complex things. There may be some things we need to figure out there as the databases become more complicated. But the underlying objective that we want to maintain with database state is that a developer can migrate, can Docker compose up, run migrations, and have a full development environment. And so if we're relying on an external RDS instance, if we're relying on some guy to give me a SQL file and import into something, it can make it challenging, especially once we throw continuous integration into the mix. So that's an area that, does that answer your question, Himanshu?
Yes, definitely. I'm just trying to think for the scenarios where I'm hoping we already have a database as of today, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in that case, do we really have to come up with migrations in that case? If there are no migrations, then how will that work?
Is the database you're working with, is this a external system?
As of now, yes.
So in that case, you may want to explore putting an API, building a small API endpoint for the database that you're trying to interact with. Whenever you get to the point, whenever any product, any application gets to the point of interacting with multiple databases, it gets very complicated very quickly and limits your ability to test. And so anytime an application, so I always think of an application as kind of like the castle walls. So like the castle is the database. Uh, that's the thing you want to protect. That's the thing, that's the reason we have authentication. That's the reason we have validation. An API is like a castle. Your database is the castle, and the API and the actual microservice are the walls around it. And so at any point, if we're kind of skipping those walls, there's risk there. And we can there can be sacrifices. It makes it really difficult to maintain that high level of testing that we're striving for.
Um,
Go ahead.
sorry, this is Anita. So, Himanshu, in an earlier meeting today, Srinivas did give a go-ahead to use these migrations for dev. So we are going to create the migrations in the application.
Okay.
We will definitely need to put extra effort to create the seeders to load master property data. That's the only concern as of now.
Okay, got you. Yeah, I mean, earlier, like when we started to learn Laravel, it was like we were having database structure in front of us, and we just have to create the model, right? But that makes more sense. Thank you, Nathan.
Excellent.
Hey Ben, this is Marag. I have a question on the API blueprint documentation. So, do we have to write the API blueprint documentation for the Dread to validate, to run the testing, or is there any tool to do that to come up with the API blueprint documentation?
Currently, we have to write that.
Okay.
And part of it's very difficult for like generating such documentation would be pretty complex. You'd have to look at the database and figure out, okay, well this column is a string value and the min and max, and well that's only a representation of what the database is capable of storing. Your actual endpoint might be a little different. So by the time you factor in everything that could happen from start to finish, generating that automatically is extremely complex, and it's probably best, due to the level of complexity, for a developer to maintain that right now.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Oops, I skipped my last slide. Did it again. Well, since you guys have already gone there, are there any other questions? And again, John, David, and I are always available. We need, due to being pulled in different directions, we need to monitor kind of the level of integration we have with different teams starting to use the Lumen starter. We want to be as helpful as possible, but it's challenging for us it can be challenging for us to answer everybody's questions all the time. So if you have a question, maybe it may be better to ask us the whys. So things like, why are we using Dread? Why is this beneficial over this thing? Why would I want to do this over this? Kind of stuff. And if you're asking like how do I do this? There's plenty of material on Google for PHP Unit, for Laravel and Lumen, and there's really good documentation on Dread as well. They have a lot of examples.
Yeah, one more question, Ben. So earlier we had a meeting with Srinivas, and the Lumen starter has a JSON API, and I have talked to John as well about this. So that defines the JSON structure and also the media type and whatnot. And one of the concerns that we had, during our meeting was, these APIs we build will be consumed by multiple, real page, products, and so it's going to take there is some challenge there to consume that output rather than using the regular JSON content type and also the just plain structure of the data. So, and we decided actually for the one of the APIs that I'm going to build, a list item, not to use a JSON API as proposed by the Lumen starter.
Okay.
Just FYI.
So one thing is probably John would be able to answer, but the concern with JSON API is the structure looks a lot more complicated, especially on the homepage of JSON API website. The example that's given there looks really complicated with all the nested relationships. So, I mean, right now we have no way of telling what will be the end output looks like for a particular API. What will be the response structure for a given API unless we code it with the JSON API and then test it to see, okay, this is how the output will look like. So is it possible to kind of, I mean, we definitely prefer using JSON API because it's a kind of a standard, and if we use it, hopefully we can make it a standard across all the different applications. But are there any configurations with JSON API which can make it a little simpler?
John, do you want to speak to that?
I can. In terms of a standard and making it simpler, it would be the responsibility, well, not it would be. It's the responsibility of the team implementing the logic and the endpoints for an API to provide the most simple interface for users. The goal of the API is not necessarily to make it easier for devs to build API endpoints and responses and stuff. The goal is to provide the simplest and easiest interface for users. If that's other devs and that sort of thing, that all needs to be taken into consideration. But the standard is in a release and production ready format. So in terms of changing the structure of it, no, that's not possible. But in terms of using metadata at this point to work around some of the things that you think will be difficult, especially in a pre-release version of your API, I don't see why something like that would be an issue. But beyond that, without looking at a specific case, I can't think of any reason why the standard would need to be adjusted.
Yeah, well, one of the concerns that that I have is the media type that's supported. So it's not a content type / JSON, and since these enterprise APIs will be consumed by other products inside the company, making it simpler for them to integrate would be a good way to design the application as far as the content type and structure of the data.
Are you stating that these other products that we have in the marketplace right now, we're not going to force them to utilize our specifications when they want to communicate to property OS and to our data? They're going to be providing other content types, like
we will be
XML,
providing. I will send you the link. But yeah, I mean, for example, you guys have built the verification. I think you are using the content type application / JSON, right?
Right.
But the Lumen starter suggests otherwise. There is a different media type called application / vnd.api plus JSON. So that's
Gotcha.
our concern.
Okay.
Okay. Before we address that specifically, which I'll let John speak to that, I do want to mention we do rely on you guys to create issues in the issues section of Lumen Starter if you have concerns, things that you think either are going to be a problem later or are a problem now or could be a potential problem. Please be sure to do that because we want to make it as easy as possible for teams. And so one of the things that appealed to us about the JSON API spec is because it's a spec and because it's consistent, it allows us the flexibility down the road for any developer jumping between any API, working on any different product, to know what the API response will be. And so if that kind of thing is customized per product, which there may be a case for that, like John said, without kind of digging in deeper, it's kind of hard to see. We might sound a little arrogant if we're like, oh yeah, you should never need to do that. If we're inconsistent somewhere, it can make it more challenging to integrate across the board. And part of that for us is going to be, with the Lumen starter down the road, we're going to add JSON Web Token authentication and have that baked in. And so authentication will be standardized across the board as well. And so the more each project varies from that, the more it's challenging to implement those standards for the teams maintaining those products. So we definitely would prefer to try to, if there's something that needs to be better in the Lumen starter, look at it from that perspective on let's improve the Lumen starter, rather than the approach of this project over here is not going to do that for this reason. But as far as the content types and things like that, John, do you want to speak to that?
It sounds like there's just a disagreement on the usability of that moving forward. So if they want to talk about it more so one-on-one, I'm more than happy to do that. But again, there's a reason for the recommendation and the planned support for it. So if you want to talk about it more, I'm more than willing to, but I don't think this is the time or place.
Okay. Well, why don't we do this? If you would, create an issue on the Lumen starter about that header concern, and give us a little bit more of a clearer picture on some challenges some other systems might have integrating with that, and any ideas you have to adjust that and correct and to better meet that need, and then that'll open up some communication for us all to chat about it. Does that work?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, guys, thank you for your time. If you have anything else, again, feel free to reach out, create an issue. It doesn't actually have to be a problem; could just be a suggestion.